Okay, so I've got best part of an hour today to convince you that if you're interested in human distress, you should be interested in body-focused repetitive behaviours, or BFRBs. And I always start with the 6 things that everyone should know about BFRBs, and most people don't. So they exist. Picking and pulling and biting of hair and skin and nails are common. They probably affect, we all do them a bit because they're normal grooming behaviours, but in terms of the over the threshold people who are experiencing a lot of distress, we're probably looking at something like 5% of people who are in that category. The distress that they cause can be quite profound. I'll show you plenty of evidence of that today. The urges that we experience to pick and pull and bite are uncontrollable. I've never made a conscious decision to pull out my hair, but I cannot control the urges to pull out my hair. So there is no conscious decision being made to pick and pull and bite. I live with urges that I find incredibly difficult to control. They're not a type of another disorder. Probably the most common questions I'm asked are about, aren't they just a type of self-harm? Aren't they just a type of OCD? Aren't they just a symptom of anxiety, etc.? And BFRBs share features with lots of other disorders, but I think it's really important that we understand them on their own and take them out of being swept under the carpet of other disorders so that we can really understand the mechanisms and figure out the best ways to help people. And finally, the stigma and shame make it really hard for people with BFRBs to ask for help. We're very rarely, if ever, asked about our picking and pulling, biting behaviours, which makes it feel like they're not allowed, even in the safe space of a psychologist or a psychiatrist room. And just to give you a flavour of what that stigma sounds like, here's things that I've heard with my own ears by different groups of professional people. At the top, we've got medical and clinical professionals. In the middle, we have hair and beauty professionals. And at the bottom, there's us lot, the researchers and scientists. We've all never heard of it. They've all never heard of it. I've heard it's not a proper condition, never seen a patient. It's all just attention seeking. It's not a hair problem. It's not a skin problem. It's disgusting. Isn't it just a type of whichever one of your favourite other disorders it is? I've never noticed, so being dismissed as it not being important, you're never going to get taken seriously and you're never going to get funding. And the loudest thing you hear as somebody living with a BFRB is, why don't you just stop it? Honestly, as somebody living with a BFRB, that's the biggest message I get, because unfortunately that's the message we get from all of the professional people that could be there to help us, and therefore it's the only thing that our friends and family know, leaving the person struggling with the BFRB just wondering to themselves, what's wrong with me? If these people are all telling me I should be able to control it, how come I can't? And what that does is set up the perfect condition for what I call the dementors of shame. Dementors, for those of you who are not Harry Potter fans, dementors are these sort of black lurky things that suck out your life force. And when no one around you is able to offer you any help, the dementors of shame, that just leaves open the doorway for the dementors of shame to be your constant inner monologue. And as you've already heard, this for me is personal. I know that when you look at this photo of me, this is pretty much what I looked like when I came to the department 25 years ago. So, and I know that when you look at this photo of me, you just see a younger version of me. You don't see anything particularly interesting or abnormal in this photo. But this photo of me has always horrified me because I had failed to cover up the bald spot on my head. I know that there are no eyelashes at all on that face, and my fingers are almost certainly covered in very painful and infected wounds from all of the biting that I've done of my fingers and the skin around them. But as Kathy said, this is something I lived with in secret, on my own, not telling anybody about it for most of my life. And then 2 or 3 years ago, it started to emerge for me that maybe I could start talking about it. And maybe if I start talking about it and start studying it, I might be able to help other people not live with those dementors of shame. So that's what I did. And as I say, Kathy was the first person I told that I was thinking about maybe considering it. And from then it rather accelerated. So I went, my coming out day was June the 21st, 2023. I wrote a blog and put it on the university website. Very quickly, I was invited onto Woman's Hour. And since then, there's been lots of work that you'll hear all about. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but coming out and being open about my BFRBs has been enormously positive for me. But it was only possible because I'd got to a point in my life where I felt very secure, academically, career-wise, home-wise. It was only possible for me to start talking about these very difficult feelings because I'm extremely fortunate to have all of those things and extremely fortunate to be in this department. So as Kathy said, we put on the first BFRB conference a couple of years ago. This was very much in collaboration with my friends and colleagues at BFRB UK and Ireland. They're a small charitable organisation that runs support groups for people with BFRBs. I know that a few of them are online, so thank you very much to them. And so what I'm doing now is research that you'll hear lots more about. I think it's incredibly important to disseminate, and I feel like I've got a particular role to play in that dissemination because I can speak from both the authority of the title that I have and the job that we all do, but also the lived experience, of course. And BFRB UK and Ireland are super important partners in this, and so are a number of other organisations around the world. Okay, so let's start with establishing what we know about basic facts and figures about BFRBs. I've already told you that they're pretty common, so something like 2 to 5% of people. I'll go into that in a bit more detail, and they start young. And in fact, this is some data that was shared with me by Suzanne Moton-Odon, who's developed an app that you can download to help you, a self-help app. This one's for hair pulling, there's another one for skin picking. But as part of setting up the app, the age of onset, people are asked what their age of onset is. And so you can see that you can start pulling out your hair at any age, but there's a very peaky peak at around about 12 years old. So just as adolescence hits, there's a very peaky peak of the onset of hair pulling, and skin picking looks pretty similar. As nail biting is probably younger and a flatter peak. We don't have data for that, unfortunately. There are probably sex differences, but even that's difficult to tell. There's not really good epidemiological evidence of any of this stuff. But what we can tell from the evidence that we do have is that if you look in clinical populations, and of course they are virtually non-existent, but in the States, there are a few people who've managed to gather together decent sized numbers of clinical, they run a clinic for people with BFRBs. The people coming to that clinic are kind of 4 to 1 female to male. However, population surveys that have been done of kind of student populations suggest that the number is maybe not quite 50-50, but closer to 50-50 in terms of the actual actions of picking and pulling and biting of hair, skin, and nails. And then a completely different bit of evidence. So doing a market research search on Google, on who's searching for why can't I stop pulling out my hair, it looks like it's about 60-40 female to male. So it looks like there might be a sex difference, but somewhere in between these extremes is probably the truth of what that might look like. Now, I talked a little bit about the co-occurring conditions at the start, but this is probably the best evidence that we have of the kind of rate of different co-occurring conditions with amongst people. In this case, of hair pulling disorder, but actually skin picking disorder is one of the bars on this graph. So the way that I read this data, this is a survey of about 10,000 people. The way that I read this is that co-occurring conditions are fairly common, anxiety and depression by far the most common. But after that, pretty much across the board, if you have any other psychological or psychiatric condition, the chances of having a hair pulling problems are sort of not non-trivial. So 20 to 30% of people with disorders as varied as OCD, PTSD, alcohol or drug abuse, eating disorders, so hugely varied. This is not uncommon with psychological research. It's really common for there to be lots and lots of co-occurring conditions. In this same study, the researchers asked the participants how they rate their hair pulling compared to the symptoms of their co-occurring conditions, and many of them rated their BFRB symptoms as worse than their symptoms of their other condition. And this sort of chimes nicely with this really nice statement that was that came from a conversation with a consultant psychiatrist who said, BFRBs are often peripheral to diagnosis and management, but often central to a patient's distress. but I really like that sentence. I think it captures the problem that we have, that these things exist and they're just sort of being ignored. Fortunately for me, and for us who are studying BFRBs, two really important and impressive and useful studies were done actually 20 years ago in the case of the hair pulling one and 15 years ago in the case of the skin picking one. So this is a group of psychiatrists and psychologists in the United States brought together by an organization called the Trichotillomania Learning Center, and they carried out these decent sized studies of the impact of living with hair pulling and skin picking in almost entirely in adults. This is, and these are treatment-seeking individuals in the States. So first of all, when you look at the range, the amount of distress experienced and the range of things that are being interfered with, the extent of the interference in people's daily lives, there's lots and lots of stuff that people feel less able to do because of their hair pulling and their skin picking. I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but there's lots of it. I thought this individual stat from the skin picking paper was useful to just highlight, because this asks how much time do you spend picking at your skin, and most people are spending between 1 and 3 hours a day. So a lot of this interference is actually is probably attributable to the time that is lost in these behaviours. I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. In both cases, these researchers asked the participants how knowledgeable they thought their healthcare provider was about the disorder that they were experiencing. And I've collapsed the data from 2 papers here to show you that the pale colours here represent essentially no information. So the healthcare provider that was being that the individual had gone to had virtually no knowledge at all of the condition. I don't hold out much hope that this light green has very much depth to it at all, and that only a tiny number of these individuals were seeing somebody that they felt was an expert. And bear in mind that these are the individuals who are recruited for this are already the ones who know about the condition and are likely to be seeking support. So I did put it in inverted commas. The treatment I put in inverted commas because, well, first of all, there aren't any that are particularly efficacious. As I'll show you on the next slide, a whole slew of psychoactive drugs have been tried in people with hair pulling and skin picking, and they've been actually fairly decently reviewed. None of the studies are huge, but nevertheless, there is no evidence for any drug reducing people's urges to pick and pull and bite so far. The best evidence that we have comes from the use of psychological therapy, and in particular this technique called habit reversal therapy. So this was the technique that was kind of taken up by that same group of psychologists on the previous slide, and adapted to be BFRB specific. And the best evidence that exists is for this treatment methodology, but actually it's the only evidence that exists, and there isn't good evidence of anything else, not because nothing else works, but nothing else has really been tried. So the evidence, if I summarize it sort of quickly, is that for people who undergo a course of habit reversal therapy, so for those who don't know, this is about concentrating very hard on the behavior itself, so being very focused on where it happens, when it happens, what else is going on, what are you feeling, what are you thinking, etc. So really kind of honing in on those urges to pick and pull and bite, and getting to know your own urges, and then looking for opportunities to put in a competing response. This psychological tool, this therapeutic approach, is fairly successful short term. So you can do this if you have any kind of habit that you want to reverse. Really, this is something that's really quite hard work. I use the analogy of lifting weights. So if you try really hard, you can do this for a bit. But eventually you just can't hold it up anymore, because there's so much effort involved in trying to make this work that the long-term efficacy of these approaches, again, the evidence is thin, but anecdotally, the long-term evidence is that there is not good. And in fact, potentially even worse, because by the time you get to the point where you just can't hold it up anymore, you feel like more of a failure, you've now had the therapy, you've spent the money, and you're still pulling out your hair. So I think that, the best evidence that we have is here, but as you'll see on this slide, it's not great evidence. It's not great in terms of what we can hope for people with BFRBs. So here's, again, these two papers. This is the horrendous list of drugs that have been tried in usually very small numbers of people. So that's for hair pulling, and this is for skin picking. This includes the psychological therapies as well. But across them all, in both cases, individuals were asked, how are you now, for those who've had treatment, how are you now compared to before you had the treatment? And again, I've just collapsed the data from the two studies. And what you should pay attention to here, so the light green is I'm a bit better, and the dark green is I'm a lot better. So most people, despite having been the lucky ones in terms of finding somebody who offers them some sort of treatment, are either worse or no better. Some are feeling a bit better, and a small number are feeling a lot better. So my feeling is there's a lot more we can do here. And again, there's a comment from an enlightened colleague who talked about the fact that the evidence base is all around the behavioural treatments, but I just don't find they work very well. So again, I think there's more to do to discover what's going to be the best bet. So far, virtually everything we know comes from studies of adults. Most studies collect data from clinical samples, which is likely to be a very small and biased a proportion of the real population of people struggling with BFRBs. Most studies focus on just one BFRB, either hair pulling or skin picking, and usually nothing much else. And the interventions that have been tried are not really based on a mechanistic understanding of what causes BFRBs. And so what do I mean by that? So this is now the beginning of me trying to figure out where we start, where we're looking for places we can go to find out more about BFRBs and to look for potential new targets. So this is the way that I have conceived it. There are 5 broad areas. These are familiar to anybody studying psychological psychiatric research, but essentially we don't know most of what's in this worm. We don't know what predisposes people to BFRBs. Why me? That's the question people ask themselves. The urges themselves, there's plenty more to know about that. What is the action? Why do we get so stuck in it? Why can't I stop once I've started? And then why does it make me feel so bad? And I spent a couple of years researching actually delving around in a whole range of other areas of science to look for some of the answers here. What I can tell you is that there's plenty to know. So in terms of why me, well, there's a massive literature on repetitive behaviours in animals it's just not been translated over into understanding the exact same behaviours in humans. There's plenty to understand about emotion regulation. Again, in other primates, picking, pulling, biting is used as a way of regulating emotions. The connection between the mind and the skin, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a couple of slides' time. Totally fascinating and not something we know enough about. Urges are not all the same. My urges are not all the same. I experience different types of urges depending on what else is going on. So I think of these as being, you can think of the emotional urges, and those are the ones that, you may well notice if you have BFRBs, that you're more likely to do it if you're feeling a bit anxious, if you're ruminating, worried about something, fretting about something. But I noticed that I'm also more likely to do it if I'm overexcited. So if I'm over aroused in any way, positive and negative, I'm more likely to pick and pull and bite. Sometimes my urges are very intensely sensory. They're not emotional. There's not really anything emotional going on. It's a feeling that feels like it comes from the follicle of the hair. It's like an itch that I need to scratch. And again, we don't know much about that. And then once you've unfortunately picked up BFRBs, just like anything else that's motor, the human brain primate brains, all brains are incredibly adapted for learning sequences of movements and then carrying them out without checking in on any decision-making bits of the brain. It's how we learn to talk and ride bikes and all of the other things that we do. So there's plenty, and so that's what we would call a habit. Habit is a kind of a dirty word in the world of BFRBs. We hate being dismissed as it being a bad habit, but actually neuroscientifically, it is a habit. It is an overlearned sequence of motor sequence that we execute without thinking about it. That is a habit. So a little bit of reconciliation needed there. There's a whole load of stuff here from cognitive neuroscience, which is like, why am I doing it? So there's a ritual involved, there's decision-making at some level involved, that what is it that's motivating and rewarding these behaviors? A really important thing to know is that when many people with BFRBs are experiencing an episode of picking and pulling and biting, we go into something that we call a trance-like state. So it's a state of kind of dissociation. Not quite with it, you're not quite in the world. It's the best way I can describe it to people who don't experience it is very similar to being sort of stuck on the sofa scrolling. You know you need to get up, you know there are other things to do, you know you shouldn't be doing this and you should be doing that, but you're stuck there anyway. And picking, pulling, biting is very powerfully keeps you kind of stuck in that can't quite get myself to move feeling. So all the things about how we're making decisions and it has to be interpreted or conceptualized through the fact that you're not actually really got access to the same decision making that you might have when you're not in this state of consciousness. And then why does it make you feel so bad? Now, obviously, there's plenty of people for whom it doesn't make you feel bad, and I'll talk more about them in a bit. But for those of us who do feel bad about our BFRBs, there's a whole range of ways in which they get us. we end up with visual consequences. We might end up with physical consequences in the form of wounds, infections that need some attention. There are lots of emotional consequences. They're actually kind of draining. I didn't really know how draining my BFRBs were until the day after I put out my coming out post, if you like. Until I lived without the constant feeling of worrying about whether my eyelashes were showing or my hair was showing. I'd lived my whole life worrying about that as a background cost to my cognitive effort. And now I don't worry about that anymore. And it's a big difference. So there's a cost, so there's a resource implication of having BFRBs. And a lot of that is actually social. And a lot of what I'll talk about next is that. So this is all in the book. So if you like the sound of all of that, the book is coming out in April and you can pre-order it now. I'm only going to focus a little and shine a little bit of light on two of these areas because I don't have time to do them all. Just because I can't resist telling you a little bit more about animal grooming behaviour and this skin-mind connection. I've cut out lots so as not to overwhelm, but I never want to cut out anything. So, animals groom. Picking and pulling and biting of hair and skin and nails is a completely normal animal behaviour. It evolved as a way of keeping the surface of our bodies clean and free from parasites, where all animals, for everything from crickets through birds, through mammals, every animal does some kind of picking, pulling, biting of their body surface in order to keep their body surface healthy and operational. Primates, over evolutionary timescale, these grooming behaviours, differently in different species, acquired additional functions. And the functions that they seem to have acquired in primates is social. So as we know, primates pick and pull and bite at each other. And it's a way of forming and maintaining social bonds. It's a way of letting somebody else in your troop know that they're safe with you, you like them. We sort of slightly lost that, although actually Robin Dunbar would argue that we still do this, we just do it in slightly different ways now. What's also very well known is that some animals, when in distress, overgroom. So here is a chimpanzee that's pulled out its fur. The pictures are a bit small, but chickens, when they're in overcrowded conditions, will pull out their feathers. If you take your cat to a cattery, the chances, some cats will come back with their patches. So it's actually a well-known phenomenon across lots of animals, across multiple species, overgroom if they're in distress. And we actually know loads and loads and loads about animal grooming. So this is a brilliant review article for anybody who's interested that tells you all about grooming behaviours, highly stereotyped ritual behaviours in rodents. And so there's a few sort of key things to learn from this. So first of all, grooming behaviours are highly ritualised, are highly stereotyped. Not necessarily across individuals, but within an individual will have a very set pattern of things that they will do. And mice, in fact, have a grooming pattern that's made up of 32 individual movements. If you interrupt a mouse halfway through its 32 movements, it'll go back to the beginning and start them all over again until it feels like it's finished. So these sorts of behaviours are kind of hardwired, if you like, or rather they have a propensity to become hardwired, that you need to go from the beginning to the end and you can't stop halfway. From the same review article, you can see that these mice are spending more time doing these behaviours if they're stressed relative to not stressed. And we know really quite a lot about the architecture in the brain, about what's controlling these behaviours. So again, there's plenty that we already know that can be ported across to our understanding in humans. And then I just wanted to highlight this incredible review that I came across very recently. This is essentially a review of all of the occasions when animals overgroom, or rather do a whole variety of behaviours that they call abnormal repetitive behaviours, and this in this case being used as an indicator of poor welfare. So this is for people who care for animals. This review has 550 something references, unbelievable, across a massive range of species. And the things that I kind of take from it that I think are really important are that repetitive behaviours are quite a reliable indicator of poor welfare. If it doesn't show up, it obviously doesn't show up in every individual, but where it shows up, the chances are that that animal has had a history of poor welfare. So it's a fairly reliable indicator of having had a bad time at some point, but these behaviours are a very poor indicator of current emotional state. So the way that it's described in this review is that these behaviours are more like a scar than a wound. So in other words, something caused the behaviours to get set up, and then once they're set up, they're there for a whole variety of reasons. And interestingly, it's very rare that these behaviours are observed in the wild. So when we send our children into secondary schools, think about how we're putting them into captivity. And I wonder about that age of onset. Okay, so just a few words on the incredible links between our brains and our skin. Now, I did psychology as a degree, and then did neuroscience a bit later. But as a neuroscientist, these days we hear quite a lot about the link between guts and brains. But there's just an exciting set of interactions to learn about that between skin and brains. Now, of course, all we learned about, if we learned about any connection between skin and brains in neuroscience, is the incredible array of sensory apparatus we have in our skin to pick up all sorts of signals that get sent into our primary sensory cortex to inform whatever happens next. And we might have learned that there are also little muscles in our skin that are controlled, of course, by the motor cortex, that do things like lift hairs up when you're cold. And so it's fairly autonomic stuff mostly. But what you probably haven't thought of, I hadn't thought of until I started studying it, is that actually emotions are really heavily expressed on our skin. In fact, our emotions all express themselves one way or another on our skin. When we're embarrassed, we blush. When we're angry or frustrated, our hair stands on end. We feel a tingle in our skin associated with particular emotions, and we have absolutely no control of this. So we know that there's a direct link here between our emotion system and our skin, and indeed the follicles of the hairs on our skin. What we also know from dermatology is that there's a whole range of what we think of as dermatological conditions that are exacerbated by stress. And this is now fairly well understood as being a kind of triangulation between an inflammatory response in the skin and the emotion response that's coming from wherever it's coming from, showing itself as either psoriasis or eczema or alopecia. So when you think of it like that, it doesn't seem like such a leap of faith to think that this some combination of the same underlying processes could give rise to a mechanical urge. So if you think of these as being, if you like, chemical response to this interaction, well, picking and pulling and biting could be a mechanical response to the same sort of interaction. And just to put some sort of flesh on the bones here, we also know that there are specific nerve fibers that transmit the information between our skin and our brain that are specialized for pleasant touch. So that grooming behavior that we learned about on the previous slide, it's operationalized as 3 centimeters per second stroking. That's the frequency of movement across our skin that our bodies like. That is a pleasant feeling for us. You know that if somebody you like strokes you at that frequency, it will feel nice. If they do it too fast, it doesn't feel nice. If they do it too slowly, it's really infuriating. And so we know that this fiber called the C-tactile afferent that's been wasn't discovered by Francis McGlone, but he's the one that's really who's really promoted its understanding in relation to psychological well-being. So we need input in our C-tactile afferent in order to feel. This is our hug neuron, as I like to think of it. And the C-tactile afferent, as you can see from this study by colleagues at Imperial, this is Claire Higgins, a hair scientist at Imperial. This is the C-tactile afferent, and it actually wraps around our follicle, as do many of our sensory neurons. So we think of our skin and our hair as being separate. Of course, they're the same organ, and much of what we feel comes from sensations that are wrapped around the hair follicle. And now check this out. I mean, I can hardly believe this next study. So this is a very recent study done by Francis and colleagues in Liverpool. So this is using a technique called microneurography. So the way it was described to me is it's a bit like hacking into a phone line. So you can stick in a tiny little needle to detect the activity in the C-tactile afferent up here, and then be stimulating down here and seeing how this is firing. So if you do that by either brushing 3 centimeters per second, or even just deflecting a single hair, this is the activity that you can pick up in the C-tactile afferent. So I think of this as this afferent, and oh yeah, it's quite nice. Thanks. Yeah, quite like that. Now, look what happens if you pull a hair out. Whoa! This is our hug neuron goes bonkers when you pull a hair out. Maybe it's not such a surprise that we have we are sort of there's some kind of reward here. Hard to articulate, nevertheless, there's something highly stimulating, potentially rewarding about pulling out a hair. Okay, so now, on the back of particularly this interaction between skin and brain, and I thought I'd use this opportunity to let you know that we have recently got a grant from an organisation called the Leo Foundation. The Leo Foundation is a skin disease foundation, born out of a pharma company. And so I'm particularly delighted that they've been persuaded that BFRBs should be funded from a skin organisation, so that we're moving it out of being just thought of as a psychological or psychiatric disorder, and actually it's got more to do with the skin than we realise. And so this is going to fund our next conference, and the next conference will be much more focused on this skin and brain link. All right, now, about time I've shown you some of the data that we've been collecting. But first, I need to tell you the model. So based on all of the research that I've done, and actually fairly early on, I came up with this idea of there being a vicious cycle. This is not very different from lots of other disorders that you could plug in lots of other disorders, and this basic vicious circle would work. So we've got some kind of distress in people with BFRBs, that leads to urges. The urges, if you can't resist them, lead to the behavior. The behavior gives you some sort of reward or relief, probably brief. Unfortunately, what happens next for many people is a feeling of shame, and that shame keeps you in distress. So this is the kind of basic vicious cycle that I think that we are stuck in. Now, there are lots of ways into this vicious cycle, as I've hopefully shown you on the previous slide. So I think you can come via the distress gateway, if you like. And anything that causes you distress can cause you to enter via that gateway. But I think you can also enter via this more sensory and regulatory, potentially immune type pathway straight to the urge, which then causes the distress in its own right. So there's a bunch of different ways in. Of course, many of these will interact with each other. And then in the middle here, we have this phenomenon, which is this trance-like state. And the way that I've sort of conceptualized it here is it sort of cuts away everything else. And in the trance-like state, you're just stuck in the bottom half of the cycle, with the urge, the behaviour of the relief, urge behaviour relief, until it lets you go. And then unfortunately the shame is pretty huge, because that's when most of the damage gets done. And then the last bit of this is that the shame is hugely amplified by the stigma that is around BFRBs. Now, most of this is hypotheses, so now we need to figure out how to test the hypotheses. And for most of the work, in fact, for all of the rest of the work that I'm going to show you, our focus has been on young people. So here are some fabulous young people. I wanted to take this opportunity to just say a huge thanks to the people who have managed to get interested in BFRBs, and not only these two, but many others as well. But Polly and Mina are both examples of people who heard me talking a bit about it and then went, oh, I can do something about that. And then before you know it, you're collaborating and you've got new research studies going on, etc. Polly and I have supervised so far to completion a couple of students, including Laura, who's over here, and we've got several more in progress. And I'm going to start by telling you about the Oxwell study. So the Oxwell survey, many of you will already know, is a survey that's been running, led by Mina Fazell through this department for a number of years now. It surveys mental health and wellbeing in school-aged children, usually done in school as part of a lesson. And a whole range of different aspects of mental health and wellbeing are captured in this survey. And Mina was persuaded that BFRBs could be incorporated as part of the optional extra questions that were done in the 2025 Oxwell survey. So here's the questions that we managed to get in. Do you sometimes pick, pull or bite your hair, skin or nails in a way that feels difficult to control? If yes, how much does this behaviour upset or distress you? How much do these behaviours interfere with a range of aspects of your life? And then where have you gone looking for help? So I'm just going to start by explaining that the BFRB subset, these are people who opted to do an additional questionnaire. It wasn't only about BFRBs, it was about several things, including BFRBs. So people didn't self-select for BFRBs, they just self-selected for extra. But so if we compare the BFRB sample, who are in pink here, with the full sample is 32,000, BFRB sample is almost 7,000. You can see that the BFRB sample are trending slightly younger, but in terms of the actual means, they're very close. They are slightly younger. More importantly, there's a bit of a gender difference. So perhaps not surprisingly, when offered a little extra to do, more girls did it than boys. And indeed, so we've got a higher proportion of girls and women in the BFRB group. We've also got a higher proportion of those who are identified as transgender, gender diverse, or unsure about their gender. So we've got nearly 5% in our BFRB group compared to 3.5%. So it's just important to bear in mind that there are some differences between the BFRB set and the full set before I show you the rest of the data. So first, there's quite a lot of data on this slide, but I'm going to start simple. So first of all, do you sometimes pick, pull or bite your hair, skin or nails in a way that feels difficult to control? About half, just over half of all of the respondents, so this is 7,000 people, say no. Only half say no. So nearly half of people who are responding to this survey say yes in one way or another to this question. And then what they say yes to, you can see here, is exactly what you would predict. So nail biting is the most common, skin picking next most common, hair pulling least common, and then we gave a category of other to catch the many other types of BFRB, like cheek biting, toe picking. There's lots of other varieties of BFRBs that you can sort of capture within those three main groups, but they are sometimes thought about as being separate. So nothing particularly surprising there, except perhaps that there's quite a lot of people doing these behaviours. I had a quick look to see if you do one, are you more or less likely to do the other? I know you can't see the detail of these pie charts, and you don't need to, because all you need to see is the difference between the blue and the yellow. So the blue means you only do this BFRB, that's hair pulling, skin picking, and nail biting, and the yellow means you do all three. So what this means is that if you're a nail biter, chances are you only bite your nails. If you're a hair puller, chances are you do all three. So it's kind of that kind of sets you up a hierarchy of BFRBs, and maybe nail biting is kind of the gateway drug to doing other things. So none of that matters very much until we can take into account distress, Because the vast majority of people who are picking and pulling and biting themselves are not distressed. So what I'm showing here is that the distress question was, how much does this behaviour upset or distress you? And the options were not at all, just a little, quite a lot, or a great deal. And I deliberately coloured the not at all and just a little very similarly, so we don't need to worry about the blue folk. The blue folk, and that's most of them, are saying they're not bothered or they're only a bit bothered. So they're all fine. They're just picking, pulling, biting for normal behaviour. We don't need to worry about them. For a bit, we get more interested in the people who seem they're quite a lot distressed by their behaviours, and then particularly interested in those who are expressing a great deal. And then the hierarchy here is the different types of BFRBs. So at the top, I've got nail biting only. So not surprising, if you only bite your nails, chances are that doesn't bother you very much. And at the bottom, I've got all three. So if you're doing picking, pulling, and biting, you have nearly 50% chance of being at least quite a lot distressed, and a 15% chance of being a great deal distressed by your behaviours. So now if we look at how that interferes with people's daily life, so these are the four categories of interference. The same distinctions apply here. And now the three lines are nail biting only at the top, hair pulling, I should have said hair pulling is next to three here. And then for this last line, the one that's showing the reddest data, it's just these orange folks. So only those who said that they were maximally distressed are showing on this bottom line. So what I take from this is that you can see impact interference across the range, potentially a bit more in the classroom. So people are struggling to concentrate or worrying more about it in a classroom setting, but also that there are quite a lot of people, even those who say that they're a great deal distressed, who are not experiencing interference in their daily life. So you can actually experience quite a lot of distress and get on with life anyway. And I put myself in that category. Right. Now, importantly, we have to go back to those gender differences, because these, as I said said earlier on, there's something important to figure out here. So now if we look at gender, I'm showing boys in green, girls in kind of orangey brown, and the transgender, gender diverse and unsure about gender group in purple. As you can see, even the transgender group are decent number. So there's 330 people in this group. So we're not talking about tiny numbers, we're talking about a decent number of people. And there's over 2,500 in the other groups. So the main thing that you can see from these data is that there is clearly a gender difference. So boys are performing BFR, or there are lower incidence of BFRBs in boys than there is in girls. And it looks like the highest incidence are actually in those who are identifying as gender diverse. That maps onto the distress. So least distress in boys, middle in girls, most distress in the gender diverse group. Now, I'm sure that some of you will have spotted there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing going on here, because if they're doing it more, we haven't got that many questions to go at, we haven't got that much data to go at. So if these women and the transgender group are carrying out the more distressing BFRBs more, they will show us having more distress. So we put the whole lot into a linear regression model, and what you find is that there is, as you would expect, there's an effect of type of BFRB, so hair pulling, this goes nail biting, skin picking, hair pulling. So the skin picking is significantly more distressing than nail biting. Hair pulling and skin picking are similarly different from nail biting. And then this is the gender difference. So this is boys and girls in orange, and the transgender in, or the gender diverse in purple. So the two things to see here are that the gender diverse group are not different from girls, but they are different from boys. And these lines are all exactly parallel with each other, so there's no interaction effect here. We have a main effect of type of BFRB and a main effect of gender. But it gets really interesting when we start to consider what other factors from within the wealth of the Oxford data might be relating to the propensity to have problematic BFRBs. So what these graphs show are the orange, and this is the yellow and orange folk from the previous graph. So for those people who have a BFRB and express at least quite a lot of distress, how likely are you to be in that group? So we're calling that group problematic BFRBs. If you are identified with neurodiverse diagnoses, if you've been recently bullied, and if you have high ratings of anxiety and depression. So as you can see, across these three different types of factors, So it looks like you're about twice as likely to have problematic BFRBs if you're neurodivergent, more than twice, so 2.5 times more likely to be bullied, to have problematic BFRBs if you've been bullied. Looks like there's a bit of a dose effect. This is less than weekly bullying and more than weekly bullying. And then a very clear dose effect between, this is the categorization of the ARCADs into people who are normal, borderline or clinical. And by the way, I've got the numbers of the total numbers of the individuals in this group. So the way to interpret that is that, I hate the word normal, but normal was the word that was used. About 5% of those who are characterised as normal, 5% of 4,911. So obviously most people are falling into the normal no groups. But when people are identifying with some of these other things, that's when you see that increased risk. But of course, all of these things are going to overlap. So if you're neurodivergent, you're more likely to be bullied, you're more likely to have anxiety and depression. So again, chucking it all into a great big logistic regression with gender and age in there as covariates, what pops out is quite interesting. So when you put it all in together, it's the internalizing symptoms. So it's the anxiety and depression scores, the total score actually, for combining anxiety and depression, has an odds ratio of 2.8 for the increased likelihood of having problematic BFRBs. Gender remains significant, as we saw on the previous slide. Bullying remains significant. So if you've been recently bullied, even if that isn't turning itself into anxiety and depression scores, it's that one's a bit more, a bit closer to the threshold, but nevertheless, that's standing up on its own. Whereas neurodivergence disappears. So if the increased rate of BFR, this is what we suggest, is that the increased rate of BFRBs in people who are neurodivergent is kind of operating through one of the other consequences of that. And age is non-significant. It's brand new data, so the ink is still dry, wet rather, on this. Okay, just check on time. Gosh, I'm running out of time. I'm going to have to speed up. I'm not going to do the summary. I will speed up. So hopefully I've convinced you that there's a relationship between distress and the behaviours. I'm now going to quickly tell you about the relationship with shame. So this is now the work that I've been doing with Polly, so that triangle that you saw on the previous slide is this same triangle. So we're trying to understand whether shame mediates the relationship between hair pulling in this case and symptoms of depression and anxiety. We collected an online sample, so we recruited online and managed to recruit 128 young people, so these are aged between 13 and 18, who all self-identified as people who are finding it difficult to resist urges to pull out their hair. One of the things that Polly noted when we first looked at these data was that in terms of the anxiety and depression, this population looks very much like a clinical population. So these are people just out there in the wild figuring it out for themselves without support, who look like their anxiety and depression levels are equivalent to those that you would find in a clinical sample. So the bottom line, sorry I'm speeding up here, is that shame partially mediates the relationship between hair pulling and depression, but it fully mediates the relationship between anxiety and depression. So what that suggests is that if you take shame out of the equation, the relationship between hair pulling and anxiety would disappear. So we need to understand more about this shame phenomenon. What do we mean? What do we mean by this? So again, I'll skip over the wordy bits. And so this brings us to Laura's project, which is a qualitative research project of exploring the experience of shame in adolescent hair pulling. This was an amazing project to be involved in. My first experience of qualitative research, so incredibly powerful and so well done by Laura. So we investigated how do adolescents with problematic hair pulling, so this is individuals from the previous cohort, experience, navigate, and make sense of shame in relation to their condition. So as I say, this is 12 of the individuals from the previous study, and Laura carried out structured interviews with these individuals. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to get any boys, so it's 11 females and 1 non-binary. And then we did a thematic analysis on all of the codes that were collected from these 12 interviews. There was one key factor that ran through everything, and then 5 themes. And I'm so sad that I've got to slightly rush this because this was such an amazing piece of work. But here are the 5 themes that came out of this study. Stigma runs through everything. So that's the sense of not understanding, there's something wrong with me, there's something that fundamental flaw feeling. And then the 5 themes, so I can't separate my BFRB from who I am, feeling fundamentally flawed. And that had a sub-themes of identity and concealment. The feeling of always being watched. And that had sub-themes that relate specifically to the family and to the school situation. Feeling misunderstood, people just don't understand, they don't get it. Feeling isolated, not being able to share it with anybody, feeling the need to hide. And disempowered, feeling out of control. Not even being aware and feeling out of control. And when I saw these results, I was there when we did the thematic analysis, so I kind of knew what was coming, but the way that Laura put it together with these themes, it was kind of mind-blowing. It's kind of, that's it. That's how it felt. That's how it felt. That's why it's so complicated, because these things are really different from each other, but they're all there in a kind of swirl of shame that you're kind of stuck with. So, and this is clearly now the beginning of how we think about where we go next with this work, and how we think about treating or supporting people differently with these things as the main focus of that. A little extra point is that several of the people that Laura interviewed contrasted their BFRB with other diagnoses, and that they were actually perfectly happy to talk about their neurodivergence and their anxiety symptoms, but BFRBs were difficult to talk about. So I am going to skip over that. The key takeaways is that you should care about BFRBs. They're common, they cause significant distress, they're under-researched, understudied and highly stigmatized. There's loads to go at in terms of mechanistic discovery and potentially treatment discovery, both neurophysiological and psychological. And the family is a really important part of this. I've skipped over some of that. Shame is a key aspect of everything. It's complicated. It runs through it's a key component of the disorder. And it should, I think, be the main target of treatment, is to reduce that shame. I did have a few things to say about being a lived experience scientist, but I'm going to leave that. Questions, and leave you with this last point, which I always like to give, which is a point about narratives. So these are 2 primates who overly pull out their hair. In the case of the human primate, the expert narrative is that the human is broken and we need to fix the human. In a different primate with exactly the same behaviours, the expert narrative is that this animal is in distress, we need to fix its environment. And I think the difference between those is really important, and it's about how we think about these things. Okay, thank you very much.